Have you ever stood in line, ticket in hand, only to feel invisible? Imagine boarding a plane, calm and composed, and suddenly being told you don't belong without reason, without proof. This is exactly what happened to Naomi Sinclair, a brilliant and resilient woman. When a routine flight turned into a test of dignity, courage, and quiet power, why was she stopped at the gate? Was it a simple mistake? Or was it something more? The eyes of strangers, the whispering laughter, the murmurs of doubt. How far would people go when they let prejudice dictate their actions, and when silence becomes louder than words? How does one reclaim control in a world eager to diminish them? As Naomi navigates the flight, the media frenzy, and the corporate chaos that follows, you'll witness not just a battle for boarding, but a confrontation with systemic bias, her resilience under scrutiny, and the power of choosing how to respond. Get ready to uncover a story that challenges what we see, what we accept, and what we fight for. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss a single moment of Naomi's journey. The terminal buzzed with its usual rhythm, the rolling wheels of carry-ons across polished floors, the faint crackle of overhead announcements, and the tired shuffle of passengers eager to board. Morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long stripes of gold across gate F-27. A line of first-class passengers formed, neat and orderly, as the boarding process began. There was no sense of drama, no raised voices, no disruption, just the quiet anticipations of departure. Dr. Naomi Sinclair stood among them, composed and steady, her boarding pass in one hand, a slim leather laptop bag draped over her shoulder. She was dressed in a navy blazer, pressed black trousers, and a pair of understated pearl earrings. The look was elegant without flash, professional without pretense. To anyone else, she appeared exactly as she was a frequent traveler in first class, moving through a routine she had lived countless times before. Her eyes scanned the screen above the gate Flight 382, nonstop to New York. Departure, 8:45 am. Seat assignment 2A. Confirmed, printed, and paid in full. She had flown this airline dozens of times, always first class, always greeted by name. But as she stepped forward, something in the atmosphere shifted. The flight attendant at the boarding door, Lauren Price, extended her arm not as a welcome, but as a barrier. Her palm faced outward, her expression flat. The motion froze Naomi mid-stride. "Ma'am," Lauren said, tone clipped and sharp, "this line is for first-class boarding." The words floated in the air, cold and unmistakable. 6 words that carried more weight than their syllables should allow. No smile, no courtesy, no effort to glance at the ticket in Naomi's hand. Just the certainty that this particular woman didn't belong. Naomi paused. She had heard variations of that tone before in classrooms where professors looked past her raised hand, in boardrooms where her ideas were echoed louder by someone else. She drew a slow breath, lifting her boarding pass so it was plainly visible. "I am in first class," she said evenly. Behind her, a man in a gray business suit muttered something under his breath, just low enough to avoid consequence. 2 women in designer sunglasses whispered and laughed softly, the kind of laugh that sought complicity from strangers. The man ahead in line turned slightly, eyes darting toward Naomi, then back to the jet bridge, choosing silence. Lauren didn't glance at the ticket. She repeated herself, louder this time, each syllable enunciated like a scolding ma'am. "I said this is for first-class passengers only." The passengers around Naomi adjusted their postures. Some leaned in, curious. Others stiffened with the tension. The quiet hum of boarding dulled to a silence that seemed to press against the walls. Naomi's boarding pass trembled slightly at the edge where her thumb pressed into the paper. She didn't step back. She didn't argue. She held it steady, her eyes unwavering, her posture unbroken. Still, she wasn't given a chance. Another attendant, Kara Thompson, approached from the side, her expression already set in judgment, as though she'd been briefed on Naomi before even arriving. Their exchange was wordless, a glance that conveyed dismissal without dialogue. Moments later, a uniformed airport security officer appeared, summoned not by chaos, but by assumption. The officer's lips pressed into a thin, neutral line as he positioned himself just behind Naomi. The temperature in the gate area seemed to drop. The ordinary hum of routine travel turned brittle. "Step aside." "Please," Kara instructed, her voice sharp, practiced. Naomi blinked slowly, measuring her breath. She extended her boarding pass again. "Seat 2A. You may scan the barcode." Kara didn't look down. Lauren didn't move. The officer shifted closer. "You're causing a scene," Lauren said, her words slicing through the silence. Naomi's heart tightened, not from fear, but from recognition. The phrase was familiar, almost scripted. It was the phrase used to flip the narrative, to shift blame, to justify escalation. Around her, the whispers grew. Phones appeared in hands, not to defend, but to document, to judge, to gawk. Naomi didn't raise her voice. She didn't frown. She didn't take a single step forward. Yet the weight of assumption was already crushing her. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," the officer said, his tone firm but not loud, the words rehearsed by repetition. Naomi turned her gaze toward him, her voice calm, almost soft. "I have a valid first-class ticket. Please check your system." But they didn't. No one typed her name into a computer. No one scanned the boarding pass. No one considered the possibility of error on their part. What they saw wasn't a CEO, wasn't a leader, wasn't a customer with platinum status. What they saw was a black woman standing where they decided she didn't belong. And so, without further conversation, Naomi was dragged away from the boarding door. Her heels scraped against the polished tile. The crowd parted silently, strangers staring, some with curiosity, some with relief that it wasn't them, others with shame disguised as indifference. Inside the cabin, the line of first-class passengers resumed, as if nothing had happened. But for those who witnessed it, the moment lingered, uncomfortable and unresolved. Naomi said nothing as she was escorted to a nearby holding area. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She didn't ask why, because she already knew. She sat in the molded plastic chair, boarding pass still in her hand, thumb pressed against its corner as if anchoring herself to proof of reality. Her mind was quiet, yet behind her composure stirred a storm of questions. How many more times would dignity be treated as optional? How often would competence be doubted before it was even tested? How long would silence be mistaken for weakness, when in truth it was the only weapon left unbroken? Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't check it. Not yet. For now. She let the silence settle around her, heavy and suffocating, but also clarifying. This was not the first time she had been underestimated, but it might be the last time someone would mistake her for powerless. The flight left without her. Naomi sat in the molded plastic chair of the holding area, her boarding pass still in hand. Around her, the terminal pulsed with movement, the shuffle of luggage wheels, the crackle of boarding announcements, the low hum of conversations that dipped whenever someone glanced her way. The distance between the gate and this chair was only a few dozen steps, but it felt like a chasm. She had crossed a threshold not of her choosing, one where dignity had been stripped in front of strangers who would carry their versions of the story without ever knowing the truth. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself, willing her pulse back into rhythm. She had practiced composure for decades, but practice didn't erase sting. In her chest, heat pooled like an ember, small but dangerous, a reminder that the hurt wasn't just about being stopped. It was about being seen and dismissed all at once, a contradiction she knew too well. Her thoughts drifted back to Detroit, to the cramped house with a furnace that rattled through winters. Her father's hands, rough from turning wrenches late into the night for neighbors who couldn't pay. Her mother's voice, weary but patient, correcting essays at the kitchen table long after midnight while Naomi did homework by her side. The lessons of perseverance weren't abstract. They were lived in bills stacked on countertops and in the sighs of parents who carried burdens quietly. She had learned resilience early, not as a word in a textbook, but as the only path forward. She had been the girl who asked too many questions, who wanted to understand why numbers on a bank notice could reduce her mother to tears. She had been the teenager who explained compound interest to classmates who didn't even know what it was. By high school, she was tutoring for extra cash, slipping the money into envelopes on her parents' dresser without explanation. At MIT, she had been the student who sat at the front, notebook open, only to be overlooked when professors searched for someone else to answer. She had been the woman in boardrooms where ideas spoken softly by her were later applauded when repeated louder by someone who looked different. And she had endured it all with a calm that masked storms, because the world didn't always grant her the option to rage, but it did allow her to endure. Now, sitting in the holding area, the echoes of those earlier humiliations swirled with the sting of this moment. She tightened her grip on the boarding pass. Seat 2A. It wasn't just a seat. It was a symbol of what she had earned, what she had paid for, and what had been denied because someone couldn't imagine her belonging. At the gate, the boarding process continued. Lauren Price stood at the door, posture stiff, eyes flicking toward the holding area now and then. Her expression wasn't guilt. It was resolve, as though she had prevented a disruption. Kara Thompson, standing nearby, crossed her arms, scanning the crowd with the same certainty. To them, this was procedure. They had turned a woman into a problem to be managed, and now they returned to their rhythm without question. Inside the line, Anthony Delgado shifted uncomfortably. He had watched the exchange unfold, had seen Naomi extend her ticket, had heard the words dismissed without a glance. He was an engineer by trade, a man who believed in systems and checks, in things verified before conclusions. What he had just seen violated that instinct, yet he stayed silent. His throat tightened with the conflict between conscience and convenience. To speak up might delay him, might cause ripples in his own travel. To stay silent kept him safe, but complicit. His fingers tapped restlessly against the handle of his carry-on, his internal debate louder than the terminal noise. A few seats away, a teenager scrolled her phone. Sophia Nien had captured a few seconds of video, Lauren's arm outstretched. The words, "This line is for first class only." Naomi's steady posture. She hadn't posted yet. She hesitated, thumb hovering over the share button. What if people called her dramatic? What if the clip went nowhere? But what if it showed the truth? She tucked her phone back into her hoodie pocket, uncertain, her young mind wrestling with the weight of what she'd witnessed. Naomi glanced once more at the gate, watching passengers file smoothly into the jet bridge. The man in the gray suit boarded without a second thought. The women in sunglasses breezed past with their designer bags. None of them were stopped. None of them were questioned. The inequity was clear, painted in motion so casual they seemed invisible to those not looking for them. Her inner voice rose, soft but insistent. You could argue. You could raise your voice. You could demand they scan the ticket. But another voice, deeper and steadier, countered. No, not here. Not like this. There would be a time, and it would matter more than shouting in a terminal where dignity had already been stripped. The officer who had escorted her away leaned near the wall, arms crossed, eyes darting toward her occasionally, but never meeting her gaze. He wasn't hostile, just detached, the embodiment of a system that treated people as tasks to be managed rather than lives with stories. Naomi studied him briefly, then looked away. He wasn't the enemy. He was a symptom. Minutes dragged. Passengers boarded. The gate area emptied. The final call was made. And then, with a hollow finality, the door closed. Flight 382 departed without her, its engines carrying away not just passengers, but the illusion of routine. Naomi remained, the weight of humiliation pressing heavier with the quiet that followed. She thought of Jordan Miles, her assistant, who had double-checked the itinerary, confirmed the catering, ensured her preferred seat was logged. Jordan would be panicking now, watching the clock, wondering why Naomi hadn't texted confirmation. In a few hours, in a conference room overlooking Manhattan, attorneys and executives would be waiting. They'd expect Naomi to arrive prepared, sharp, ready to sign what had been billed as the deal of the decade. But those attorneys, those executives, didn't know what had just happened at Gate F-27. They didn't know their billion-dollar partner had been told, without words, but with certainty, that she didn't belong. Naomi straightened slightly in her chair, adjusting her blazer as if restoring armor. She would not text Jordan yet. She would not make a scene here. Instead, she let her thoughts focus on precision, on timing, on leverage. The humiliation was raw, but it was also clarifying. Some battles weren't fought in terminals. They were fought in boardrooms, in contracts, in the spaces where silence spoke louder than protest. The officer shifted again, clearing his throat. Naomi ignored him. Her mind had already moved beyond this holding area. She pictured the faces around the conference table, the shareholders hungry for results, the executives chasing projections. She pictured Richard Calloway, the chairman who had smiled warmly at her 2 weeks earlier, calling her company's technology the future of aviation. Did he know that future was slipping through his fingers in real time? Did he know that while his staff dismissed her at the gate, she held the power to dismantle months of negotiation with a single phone call? Naomi exhaled, steady and deliberate. She would wait for the right moment. And when it came, she would not raise her voice. She wouldn't need to. The holding area smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. Naomi sat upright, still clutching her boarding pass, as though the flimsy rectangle of paper were both evidence and lifeline. She knew it wasn't the first time someone had looked at her and seen a question mark instead of an answer, a problem instead of a passenger. But the sting of this time was sharper because it carried more weight than a missed flight. This wasn't just about inconvenience. It was about perception, about power, about the very foundation of belonging. She rose slowly from the chair, smoothing her blazer with practiced hands, and walked back toward the gate counter. Lauren Price, still stationed at the boarding door, stiffened the moment Naomi approached. Kara Thompson, arms folded across her chest, moved half a step closer as though anticipating confrontation. The plane had not yet pushed back. A few stragglers still hurried toward the gate, their boarding passes scanned without incident. No challenge, no hesitation, just routine. Naomi held her pass forward once again, steady, unflinching. "Seat 2A, she said, her tone even. "Scan it, please." Lauren's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced at Kara, then shook her head. "Ma'am, you need to step aside. You've already been addressed." Naomi kept her voice calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Addressed is not the same as acknowledged. This is a confirmed boarding pass." Kara stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "We've asked you to stop disrupting the boarding process. If you continue, we'll be forced to involve further security." The word disrupting landed like a hammer. Naomi hadn't raised her voice, hadn't moved aggressively, hadn't done anything beyond stand in line like every other passenger. Yet the narrative was already being rewritten in real time, casting her as a source of disorder when all she had done was exist where they didn't expect her. From within the cabin, a voice cut through the tension. Anthony Delgado, seated near the doorway in 3C, leaned into the aisle. He had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort, each word grinding against his sense of fairness. His voice was tentative, but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "She showed her ticket." "I saw it." Lauren's head snapped toward him, eyes sharp with warning. "Sir, please remain seated." Anthony hesitated, then sat back slowly, shame burning in his chest. His courage had flickered, but the flame wasn't strong enough to withstand the chill of authority. Behind him, a teenage girl angled her phone slightly higher. Sophia Nguyen, quiet in her oversized hoodie, had been recording since Naomi reapproached the counter. Her camera captured the stillness in Naomi's face, the tightness in her jaw, the tremor of her boarding pass held steady despite hands that wanted to tremble. Sophia's heart thumped hard in her ears. She knew what she was filming mattered, though she wasn't yet sure what to do with it. Kara gestured to the officer still stationed nearby. "Escort her, please." The officer stepped forward again, his presence looming larger now. He didn't grab her this time. He simply placed a hand near her elbow. A silent suggestion made tangible. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Naomi inhaled, the breath slow and deliberate. She looked at him directly, her eyes steady, harder for whom she asked softly. For a moment, the officer faltered, his gaze shifting downward. But procedure was procedure. He nodded toward the seating area, his authority quiet but immovable. Naomi let the silence stretch. Every fiber of her being wanted to argue, to demand justice in that very moment. But another part of her, the part tempered by years of being doubted and dismissed, told her the truth. The gate was not the battlefield. Not today, not this way. She lowered her boarding pass, folded it once, and placed it carefully in her blazer pocket. Without another word, she turned and walked back toward the holding chairs. Her heels clicked against the tile, sharp notes in the muted symphony of the terminal. Eyes followed her, whispers trailed her, and phones captured fragments of her dignity being whittled down to rumor. Inside, her mind spun. Was silence strength, or was it surrender? Was restraint wisdom, or cowardice? She pressed her hand against her blazer pocket, feeling the outline of the folded boarding pass. Proof of her belonging was right there, yet useless in the face of refusal. She closed her eyes briefly. She could not let them decide what her silence meant. She would decide, and when she did, the weight of her choice would not be measured in whispers but in consequences. On board. Kara whispered something to Lauren, and both women nodded with satisfaction. To them, order had been restored, a passenger removed, a potential disruption quelled. They didn't realize they had set in motion something far larger than an awkward boarding delay. Anthony Delgado sat rigid in his seat, his conscience gnawing at him. He had spoken once and been silenced, but the image of Naomi's steady gaze stayed with him. He tapped a note into his phone, a promise to himself. If this story reached the light of day, he would not hide his name. He would tell the truth of what he had seen. Sophia Nguyen replayed the clip she had recorded. The video was only 30 seconds, but it told a story: a woman extending a boarding pass, attendants refusing to look. The phrase, "You're causing a scene," delivered to someone who hadn't moved. She felt the weight of decision pressing on her thumb again. Post it now or wait. Her heart said post. Her nerves said wait. She slipped the phone back into her pocket, torn, but knowing the moment would return to her later, demanding resolution. Naomi sat once more, her mind sharper now than it had been moments earlier. She thought of Jordan, her assistant, already pacing somewhere, fielding calls from attorneys who assumed Naomi was on her way. She thought of Richard Calloway, the airline chairman, whose cheerful voice just 2 weeks earlier had praised her vision as transformative. She thought of the $5 billion partnership papers waiting in a Manhattan conference room. And she thought of the irony that the very airline prepared to tie its future to her company had just dismissed her as though she were disposable. The officer returned to his place near the wall, his presence less intrusive now, almost sheepish. The flight doors closed. Engines roared in the distance. Flight 382 pulled back from the gate, its future altered in ways no one yet understood. Naomi leaned back in her chair, her posture regal despite the humiliation. She knew what they thought they had done, removed a passenger who didn't belong. But she also knew the truth. They had removed the one person capable of delivering their future. And soon they would realize the cost. She closed her eyes, inhaled, and whispered to herself words her mother had repeated through countless hardships. Stillness is not weakness. It's preparation. The terminal had emptied. The buzz of boarding announcements faded into silence, leaving only the occasional echo of footsteps and the low hum of air vents overhead. Naomi sat alone in the holding area, her blazer smoothed across her lap, her boarding pass folded neatly in her pocket like evidence waiting to be presented to the right court. The weight of humiliation pressed against her chest, but beneath it was something steadier, stronger, a current that had carried her through years of quiet battles. She could feel the eyes of the officer still standing guard, though he kept his distance now. His stance had softened, no longer looming, just present, as though even he wasn't sure why he remained. Naomi ignored him. Her mind was already beyond this gate, beyond this airport. Her phone buzzed again. She finally pulled it from her pocket, the screen lighting up with a flood of notifications. Jordan Miles had called 6 times. There were texts stacked one after another. "Where are you? Did you board? Legal is in the room already. They're waiting for you in Manhattan." Naomi scrolled past them, her thumb deliberate, her expression unreadable. Then she stopped on one name in her contacts. The name wasn't buried deep, it was pinned at the top, reserved for moments that demanded more than press releases or damage control. Moments like this. Her finger hovered. She thought of her parents again, of the countless nights they had worked themselves weary so she could sit in classrooms where no one expected her to excel. She thought of the years she had spent in boardrooms biting her tongue, weighing every word, because one outburst could erase every credential. She thought of today, of being told she didn't belong, and how those words had been sharpened by the certainty with which they were spoken. She pressed the name, The phone rang once. "Naomi," came the voice on the other end. "Cheerful, oblivious. Everything good for the morning. We've got the conference room at 8 sharp. Legal signed off on everything. It's a big day." She closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. "Richard," she said evenly, "I won't be there." The pause on the other end stretched long enough to cut the air between them. "I'm sorry, what? Did I hear you right?" Her voice did not rise. She spoke each word with precision, like carefully measured notes. "I was prevented from boarding your aircraft this morning. I was told, in front of a crowd, that this line was for first-class passengers only. I held out my ticket. They never looked. Security escorted me away as though I were a threat. And then I was told I was causing a scene." She could almost hear Richard's mind racing on the other end, the cheerful tone draining away. He stammered, "Naomi, that must be a misunderstanding. We'll reprimand the agents. Let me—" "You don't need to fix them," Naomi interrupted. Her tone was calm, deliberate, but it carried the weight of finality. "You need to fix your culture." The silence that followed was thick. Richard exhaled audibly. "Naomi, we've been building this partnership for almost 2 years. Think of the teams involved, the hours invested. Please, let's not allow an isolated incident to derail everything. We'll issue an apology immediately, whatever you need." Naomi's eyes fixed on the far wall of the terminal. A mural painted there showed a city skyline at sunset, a manufactured attempt at beauty in a place built for transients. She let her gaze linger, her voice never wavering. "My company will not partner with an airline that treats a black woman with a first-class ticket as though she doesn't belong. If this is how you treat me, imagine how you treat people who don't have power. We're done." Her words landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples expanding outward. Richard tried again, desperation creeping into his tone. "Naomi, listen, this deal is critical for us. It's critical for you. The system you've designed. It can't scale without our global infrastructure. We need each other. Don't do this." But Naomi had already decided. The humiliation of the gate wasn't just personal. It was systemic. It was about the hundreds of silent moments like this one that happened to people without a platform, without leverage. And today, she had leverage. Her reply was measured, final. By 6 My legal team will issue termination papers under Clause 17. You'll receive them formally. There will be no press release. There will be no negotiation. But I expect you understand what this means. On the other end, Richard's breath caught, his words tumbling. "Please at least meet with us, Naomi." She ended the call. The phone screen went dark, leaving only her reflection staring back. For the first time that morning, her lips parted slightly, and she exhaled with something close to relief. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Just release. She leaned back against the plastic chair. The terminal around her quiet now, emptied of its morning rush. The silence wasn't suffocating anymore. It was purposeful. Her mind wandered briefly, imagining the boardroom in Manhattan when the news arrived. The rows of executives in tailored suits, the attorneys with binders stacked high, the assistants checking clocks nervously. She pictured their confusion first, then their disbelief, and finally their dawning horror. A deal worth $5 billion evaporating, not because of performance metrics, not because of poor negotiations, but because of dignity denied in a boarding line. The irony was sharp. They had treated her as though she didn't belong in first class, when in truth, she had been the only first-class ticket to their future. Her phone buzzed again. Jordan this time. Another text flashing across the screen. Naomi, are you okay? Please call me. Everyone's asking where you are. I can't keep stalling much longer. Naomi typed slowly, carefully, before hitting send. I'm fine. I'll explain soon. Trust me. She slipped the phone back into her blazer pocket and rose from the chair. Her heels clicked steadily against the tile as she walked toward the exit. She didn't look back at the gate. She didn't need to. The past 2 hours had already written themselves into a chapter she would never forget, one that would soon ripple far beyond these walls. Outside, the morning sun had climbed higher, spilling across the drop-off lanes. Travelers rushed past her, oblivious to what had just shifted inside. She paused at the curb, inhaling deeply. The city's noise swallowed the silence of the terminal. But inside her, stillness remained. The call had been made, the trigger pulled. The rest would unfold on its own. By the time Naomi's car pulled away from the terminal curb, a ripple was already forming miles away in a Manhattan high-rise. On the 42nd floor of the Sterling Tower, a conference room filled with glass walls and polished oak hummed with anticipation. Executives in tailored suits gathered around a long table, their voices low but confident. On the screen, at the front of the room, a digital clock ticked steadily toward 8. Stacks of binders lined the table, each stamped with the Helios Nexus logo and the airline's crest side by side. It was meant to symbolize partnership, the merging of two forces into something transformative. But even as the minutes slipped away, the seat at the head of the table remained empty. Jordan Miles, Naomi's assistant, stood just outside the room, her phone pressed to her ear. She had called Naomi again, hoping for reassurance, hoping for clarity. Instead, she got a text short, precise, and final. Trust me. Jordan lowered the phone, her pulse quickening. She knew Naomi well enough to recognize the weight behind those words. Trust me didn't mean a small delay or a missed flight. Trust me meant something irreversible had already happened. Inside the conference room, Stephen Ward, the airline CEO, drummed his fingers against the tabletop. He was a man used to control, used to schedules that bent around his authority. He checked his watch, then glanced toward Richard Calloway, the chairman. Richard's normally composed face looked pale, as if he had aged a decade overnight. "What's the delay?" Stephen asked, his tone sharp. Richard cleared his throat. "She's not coming?" The words landed like a blow. The room fell silent. Executives shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between one another. "What do you mean? Not coming?" Stephen's voice rose, tinged with disbelief. "This is a $5 billion signing. She doesn't just decide not to show." Richard exhaled heavily, the weight of Naomi's call still pressing against him. "She called me directly. Something happened at LAX this morning. She said she was prevented from boarding, escorted out, treated like he stopped himself, the shame of repeating her words almost too heavy. She said the deal is off, effective immediately." Gas echoed around the table. One executive muttered a curse under his breath. Another rubbed her temples, already envisioning the financial fallout. Stephen pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You let this happen. You're telling me that after 19 months of negotiations, after millions in legal fees and endless strategy sessions, it's gone because of a boarding incident." Richard's voice cracked slightly. Something rare for a man of his stature. "Not just an incident, an indictment. She told me we don't need to fix the agents. We need to fix our culture." The words hung in the air, damning in their simplicity. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the steady tick of the clock on the screen, mocking them. Finally, one of the vice presidents leaned forward, her voice strained. "We have to salvage this. Issue an immediate apology. Fire the staff involved. Make a public statement. She can't possibly walk away from something this large." Jordan stepped into the room then, her presence quiet but firm. She wasn't supposed to be here, but she couldn't stay outside any longer. Every eye turned toward her, and for a moment she felt the weight of their scrutiny. She steadied herself. "Dr. Sinclair has already instructed legal to terminate under Clause 17, Jordan said. "The paperwork will be delivered within the hour." The room erupted. Voices overlapped in disbelief, in anger, in desperation. Someone slammed a fist against the table. Someone else muttered about shareholders, about the market reaction, about careers on the line. Stephen turned on Jordan, his face flushed. "You're her assistant. Convince her to reconsider. Tell her she can't do this." Jordan met his gaze without flinching. "She doesn't make decisions she hasn't already considered. If she says it's done, it's done." Richard closed his eyes briefly, the memory of Naomi's calm voice still replaying in his head. He had thought he could persuade her, that charm and promises could soften the blow, but he had underestimated her resolve. The conference room dissolved into chaos. Phones lit up as executives began calling investors, whispering frantically into receivers. Emails flooded inboxes, urgent subject lines flashing like alarms. Outside the glass walls, assistants scurried down hallways, sensing the tremors before they even understood the quake. In the middle of it all, Jordan remained still. Her loyalty to Naomi was unshakable, but even she felt the enormity of what was unfolding. She knew Helios Nexus could survive without this deal. It had other offers, other paths forward. But for the airline, this was existential. The systems Naomi's team had built weren't just upgrades. They were lifelines. Without them, the airline's fragile recovery would collapse. Stephen's voice cut through the din, raw with anger. "Do you have any idea what the market will do when this gets out? Our stock will crater. We'll lose investor confidence overnight." Richard finally spoke again, his voice hoarse. "It already has. News like this doesn't stay quiet. By midday, the industry will know." He wasn't wrong. Even as he spoke, whispers were already circulating at an industry breakfast across town. Executives from rival airlines exchanged knowing glances, their phones buzzing with messages that began with two words. "Did you hear?" Back in the Sterling Tower, the conference room felt smaller by the second. The air was heavy, oppressive. The executives who had strutted in hours earlier now looked like cornered animals, scrambling for escape routes that didn't exist. Jordan's phone buzzed again. A text from Naomi. Just 3 words. "Leave them reeling." She slipped the phone back into her pocket, her face composed. For the first time since stepping into the room, a flicker of quiet satisfaction bloomed in her chest. Naomi wasn't reacting in anger. She was orchestrating. And the orchestra had just struck its first devastating chord. As the meeting dissolved into shouting matches, Richard stared out the glass wall at the city below. Manhattan stretched endlessly, indifferent to the chaos unraveling inside. He thought of Naomi's final words. "If this is how you treat me, imagine how you treat people who don't have power." He knew she was right, and he knew they were finished. Sophia Nguyen sat cross-legged on her hotel bed, her laptop open but forgotten, textbooks stacked nearby like props she had no intention of reading. The morning replayed in her mind on a loop, sharper with each cycle. She had captured it all. The clipped tone of the gate agent, the way Naomi's boarding pass trembled slightly but was never scanned. The uniformed officer looming as though presence itself could rewrite truth. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Friends were sharing memes, songs, random posts, but her thumb hovered over a single video in her camera roll. 30 seconds long. 30 seconds that told more truth than an hour of explanations. She watched it again. The frame was shaky at first, then steady. Naomi's calm voice, the refusal of the agent, the words that sliced the air. "You're causing a scene." Sophia bit her lip. She wasn't an activist. She was just a sophomore trying to keep her scholarship, working shifts at a coffee shop back home. Posting this would mean opening herself to questions, maybe even criticism. People might say she was exaggerating, that she had taken it out of context. But when she looked at Naomi's face on the screen, the quiet dignity in her eyes, Sophia knew silence would make her complicit. She tapped upload. The video hit Twitter first, her caption simple. "This happened at LAX this morning. She had a valid first-class ticket. Watch how they treated her." She set the phone down, her heart racing. Within minutes, retweets spread like sparks leaping across dry grass. Comments flooded in. "Who is she?" "Unbelievable. Same thing happened to my mom last year. They didn't even scan the ticket." By the time Sophia refreshed her feed, the view count had tripled. An hour later, the video had crossed into hundreds of thousands. By midday, it was everywhere. Hashtags bloomed like wildflowers, sharp and urgent. First class while black. Naomi Sinclair. Dignity denied. Sophia's phone nearly vibrated off the bed. Journalists messaged her for permission to use the clip. Activists thanked her. Strangers called her brave. She curled into herself, overwhelmed, but she didn't delete it. She couldn't. The truth was no longer hers to hold. Across the country. Jordan Miles sat in a black car, moving steadily through Manhattan traffic. She had been refreshing her phone as well, each update confirming what Naomi had predicted. The silence from Naomi's side wasn't a weakness. It was strategy. Naomi hadn't posted, hadn't spoken to a single outlet, and yet her story was spreading faster than any press conference could have managed. Inside Helios Nexus headquarters, the communications team was on high alert. Reporters called nonstop, begging for statements. Jordan answered none of them. She knew Naomi's instructions by heart: say nothing. The power wasn't in explanations. The power was in letting the world watch, letting them draw their own conclusions from unfiltered footage. Meanwhile, inside the airline's corporate office, panic deepened. Executives watched the video in disbelief, pausing, rewinding, searching for some defense, some technicality that might absolve them. But the evidence was plain. There was no shouting, no disruption, just a woman calmly extending her boarding pass, and an airline refusing to see her. Stephen Ward slammed a folder shut so hard that papers fluttered to the carpet. "We need to control this narrative. Issue a statement immediately. Call it an unfortunate miscommunication." Richard Calloway shook his head, his voice weary. "It's too late for that. The clip speaks louder than anything we say." But Stephen wasn't listening. He barked orders into his phone, summoning PR directors, demanding crafted language, clinging to the illusion that spin could erase what millions had already seen. Back in Los Angeles, Naomi sat in her office, the blinds half drawn. Her desk was neat, her phone silent on purpose. She hadn't checked the video, though Jordan had texted her an update. It's viral. Naomi leaned back in her chair, eyes closed. She could almost hear the swirl of voices online, the outrage, the solidarity, the disbelief. But she also knew there would be dismissal, mockery, resistance. She had lived through enough cycles to expect it. The question was never whether people would see the truth. The question was whether they would care enough to demand change. She opened her eyes and stared at the painting on her office wall, an abstract swirl of blues and grays. She had bought it years ago from a local artist, drawn to the chaos within the pattern. At the time, she hadn't known why. Now she understood. The chaos made space for focus. Noise sharpened silence. Jordan entered quietly, a tablet in her hand. "It's at 3 million views," she said. "Every major outlet has picked it up. They're calling it the Sinclair incident." Naomi's lips curved slightly. Not a smile exactly, but something steadier. "Let them." Jordan hesitated. "Are you sure you don't want to say anything?" Naomi shook her head. "They expect anger. They expect noise. They don't know what to do with silence." In Chicago, a group of young professionals huddled around a laptop during their lunch break, watching the video for the third time. One woman shook her head in disbelief. She didn't even raise her voice, and they still called her a problem. In Atlanta, a retired teacher forwarded the clip to her daughter with a note. "Remember what I told you about standing tall? This is what it looks like." In San Francisco, a team of engineers abandoned their whiteboard session to debate what corporate accountability really meant. Their conversation sparked by a 30-second video from a teenager's phone. The spark had leapt. The fire was spreading, and through it all, Naomi remained silent. Late that evening, Sophia lay awake staring at the glow of her phone. The clip had crossed 10 million views. She scrolled through comments, her name mentioned again and again. Some praised her for speaking up. Others questioned her motives. She felt the weight of it, the responsibility of having set something in motion far larger than she imagined. But then she saw one comment pinned at the top, written by a woman whose profile picture showed streaks of gray hair. "Thank you. We've all been her. We've all been told we don't belong. Today, at least, the world saw it happen in real time." Sophia put the phone down, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. For the first time since uploading the clip, she felt at peace. At midnight in New York, Richard Calloway sat in his office alone, the city lights flickering beyond the glass. He replayed Naomi's voice in his head, calm and cutting. "You don't need to fix them. You need to fix your culture." He knew the airline was already bleeding value. He knew shareholders would demand answers by morning. But beneath the panic was something else, something heavier. Guilt. He had seen discrimination before, in quiet corners, in unspoken assumptions. He had ignored it, rationalized it, told himself culture took time. But Naomi's silence had stripped away those excuses. Culture wasn't abstract. Culture was action. And culture had just cost him $5 billion. As the city slept restlessly, Naomi sat in her office, light still glowing, pen in hand. She jotted notes not for press statements but for plans, scholarships, mentorship programs, equity initiatives. The deal had ended, but something else was beginning. And though the world didn't know it yet, the spark that Sophia had set loose that morning would not be contained. The morning shows opened with urgency, not the usual blend of celebrity gossip and weather updates, but a headline carried in bold letters across the screen: "First-class passenger removed. $5 billion deal in jeopardy." Clips rolled again and again. The shaky video of Naomi Sinclair at the gate replayed until it etched itself into the national consciousness. The anchors' voices were measured, but their eyes betrayed fascination. Here was a story that mixed outrage, business intrigue, and social justice all in one. By mid-morning, every network had sent crews to Helios Nexus headquarters. Cameras crowded the sidewalks, hoping for a glimpse of Naomi. She never appeared. The glass lobby reflected the city back at them, opaque and silent. In contrast, the airline's headquarters became a storm. Reporters shouted questions as executives brushed past, their faces taut, their responses evasive. What went wrong at the gate? Who is responsible? Is the deal really off? None of them had answers that satisfied. The longer they dodged, the more complicit they looked. Cable news picked up the thread by noon. Panels of analysts debated in real time. Some leaned on business metrics, pointing out how the loss of Helios Nexus technology would slash efficiency and cost the airline hundreds of millions. Others spoke with a sharper edge, arguing that the real issue was not logistics but culture. On one network, a commentator leaned forward, her tone cutting. This isn't about one gate agent. This is about systemic bias. The fact that no one thought to check her ticket speaks volumes, and the fact that she was escorted out without verification tells us even more. Across town, in a cafe filled with graduate students, the debate spilled over into conversations. One table argued about whether Naomi should have fought louder in the moment. Another countered that her restraint was exactly what gave the video its power. A young man shook his head, saying softly, "She didn't have to scream. She just had to exist." And they still treated her like she didn't belong. Meanwhile, in boardrooms far removed from airports, CEOs and investors watched the fallout closely. Some whispered to their communications directors, "Make sure we're not the next headline." Others drafted emails about reviewing diversity protocols, not out of conviction, but out of fear. At Helios Nexus, Jordan Miles monitored the coverage with a steady hand. She sat with the communications team, who were restless and eager to respond. Should we issue a statement, one asked? Should we highlight her record? Remind them she's not just any passenger, but the CEO? Jordan shook her head firmly. No, she doesn't need validation. Her work speaks for itself. The silence is the statement. The team exchanged uneasy glances, but none pressed further. They trusted Jordan's closeness to Naomi, even if they did not fully understand the strategy. That evening, primetime anchors dissected the day's developments. Some focused on the financial collapse, showing graphics of plummeting stock values. Others emphasized the human story, interviewing Black travelers who shared eerily similar experiences. A mother described being asked 3 times to show her boarding pass for a seat she had paid for. A professor recounted being told to step aside until her credentials were checked again, even though the scanner had already beeped green. A business executive admitted she stopped booking certain airlines altogether because of the scrutiny she faced in first class. Each testimony echoed Naomi's silence, layering story upon story until the pattern became impossible to ignore. Social media amplified the effect. Hashtags trended globally. Memes mocked the airline's hollow statements. A viral tweet read, "She built the table, and they told her to step aside." Another quipped, "Imagine losing $5 billion because you couldn't be bothered to scan a ticket." By midnight, the airline's public relations team issued a formal statement. It called the event an unfortunate misunderstanding and promised a full review. The language was polished, sanitized, dripping with legal caution. But the public wasn't fooled. The comments beneath the post were scathing. A misunderstanding is missing a connection. This was humiliation. If she hadn't been who she is, no one would care. How many others have you treated this way journalists dissected the wording on live television? Notice they don't acknowledge race. One analyst said, notice they don't even mention her name. They're protecting themselves, not their passengers. Back in her apartment, Sophia Nguyen scrolled through her notifications in disbelief. Her video had crossed 20 million views. She had gained thousands of followers overnight. Her inbox flooded with interview requests. She declined them all, overwhelmed but resolute. The video wasn't about her. It was about Naomi, and Naomi, true to form, remained silent. She spent the evening in her office, reviewing notes, not about the incident, but about future initiatives, scholarships for young women in STEM, partnerships with community organizations, internal policy reviews for Helios Nexus. She wasn't reacting, she was building. The world saw humiliation. She saw an opportunity to shift power. Jordan entered quietly, holding a tablet. The networks keep asking if you'll speak. The pressure is mounting. If you don't say something soon, they'll start filling in the blanks themselves. Naomi looked up, her expression calm, almost serene. Let them. My silence is louder than their speculation. Outside, the city pulsed with energy. Conversations humming in bars, apartments, and offices. Everywhere, people argued, debated, reflected. Some resisted the narrative, dismissing it as overreaction. But many more recognized themselves, their families, their friends in Naomi's quiet resistance. The breaking point had been reached. Naomi had not spoken a word publicly, yet her name was on every screen, her image replayed on every channel. She had become a symbol, not by choice, but by circumstance, and by the strength of refusing to play the role forced on her. For the airline, the silence was unbearable. They couldn't negotiate with silence, couldn't spin it, couldn't dilute it with corporate jargon. Silence was unassailable. Silence was final. And so, as the city prepared for another restless night, one truth echoed across newsrooms, classrooms, and living rooms alike. Sometimes the loudest voice is the one that chooses not to speak at all. At sunrise the following morning, the glass towers that housed the airline's headquarters reflected a city already buzzing with unease. Shareholders had not slept. Neither had the executives. Overnight, markets had punished the airline's stock, wiping billions from its valuation. Analysts on morning business programs shook their heads, warning of lasting reputational damage. What had begun as a moment at a gate had metastasized into a corporate crisis of historic scale. Inside the building, executives filled a conference room with red eyes and clenched jaws. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee, the only fuel keeping them upright. The big screen at the end of the room displayed charts and live feeds, a plunging stock graph. Naomi Sinclair's face frozen mid-frame on news channels, and Twitter hashtags scrolling in real time. Stephen Ward slammed his palm against the table. This is hysteria. A minor boarding error is being weaponized against us. We need to take control before this spirals further. From the far end of the table, Richard Calloway's voice cut through. Heavy with fatigue, it's already spiraled. We lost the Helios Nexus contract. That wasn't hysteria. That was $5 billion. And it was preventable. Murmurs rippled across the room. A vice president of finance, normally quiet, leaned forward. Our institutional investors are demanding answers. Vanguard, BlackRock, Templeton. They're all asking how one incident could destroy months of work. They're questioning leadership. Stephen's jaw tightened. Then tell them the truth. Tell them we're handling it. Fire the agents involved. Issue a stronger statement. Promise reforms. This doesn't need to define us." Richard shook his head. "You still don't understand. It already does. The clip isn't about one gate agent. It's about us. About a culture that allowed this to happen without hesitation." Naomi was right. You don't fix this by scapegoating a few employees. The room grew quiet. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided Richard's gaze. Others glared at Stephen, silently choosing sides. The fracture lines were visible now. A communications director cleared her throat. "We're drafting a full apology, naming Dr. Sinclair directly, acknowledging the seriousness of the event. But we're also fielding dozens of requests for interviews. If we send out the wrong spokesperson, it could make matters worse." Stephen turned, his voice sharp. "I'll handle it myself. We need strength, not weakness." Richard exhaled. "What we need is humility. Something you've never been very good at." The jab landed, drawing startled glances from around the table. Stephen's face flushed. For years, the two men had balanced one another: Richard, the steady chairman with gravitas, and Stephen, the brash CEO who thrived on force. But now the balance was breaking. Meanwhile, across the street, investors were gathering in a private suite. They watched the numbers fall, listened to advisors describe the speed at which customer trust was evaporating, and whispered about whether Stephen Ward should remain at the helm. By mid-morning, an emergency shareholder call was scheduled. Hundreds dialed in, their voices clipped and impatient. The operator barely finished introductions before questions flew like darts. Why had the airline not protected its most important partnership? Who was accountable? What structural changes were being made? Stephen attempted to steady the call. He framed the event as an unfortunate misunderstanding, repeated phrases about renewed commitments, and promised that the matter was being taken seriously. But the words fell flat. Investors wanted more than promises. They wanted blood. One voice rose above the rest. "Mr. Ward, with respect, this is not a PR hiccup. This is catastrophic governance failure. You let bias cost us billions. If leadership cannot ensure basic dignity for passengers, why should we trust you with shareholder capital?" The silence that followed was more damning than any insult. Even Stephen felt it. Richard finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "We will be convening the board within 24 hours to evaluate leadership stability. Every position, including mine, is under review." The call ended in chaos. Investors dumped shares, analysts cut ratings, and news outlets reported the possibility of executive shakeups before noon. Inside her office across the country, Naomi read the updates in silence. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply underlined a sentence in her notebook. "Silence exposes truth." Jordan entered with a folder. "The airline stock is down another 12%. Analysts are calling it the Sinclair effect." Naomi closed the notebook and set down her pen. "It's not about me. It's about what they allowed themselves to be." Back at headquarters, the fracture widened. Mid-level managers whispered in hallways, some aligning with Stephen, others with Richard. Rumors of resignations swirled. A few employees quietly reached out to journalists, providing insider accounts of discriminatory practices long ignored. By late afternoon, an expose appeared online, quoting anonymous staff who described years of complaints buried by middle management. The headline was brutal: "The culture that dragged a CEO off her flight." Phones lit up again, but this time with fury. Senators tweeted demands for accountability. Advocacy groups called for congressional hearings. Travel influencers told millions of followers to boycott the airline until structural reforms were visible. Stephen raged. He stormed into the boardroom, waving the article like evidence of betrayal. "This is coordinated. Naomi is orchestrating this. She wants to destroy us." Richard's voice was steady, almost weary. "No, she doesn't have to orchestrate anything. We destroyed ourselves." The words sank into the silence. For the first time, even Stephen had no retort. The sun dipped behind the skyline, casting the boardroom in amber light. Shadows stretched across the table where men and women sat exhausted, hollowed by the weight of collapse. One director finally spoke, her tone resigned. "We can't reverse this overnight, but we can decide what kind of company we'll be after the fall. Right now, all anyone sees is arrogance, denial, and failure. If we don't change, there won't be anything left to save." Richard nodded slowly. "Then tomorrow, we begin with truth. No more spin, no more half measures. We admit what happened, and we hold ourselves accountable." Stephen bristled, but said nothing. His authority was unraveling, thread by thread. Outside, the city lights flickered on, illuminating the streets where commuters hurried home, where televisions glowed behind windows, replaying Naomi's calm defiance. The airline had tried to minimize her, to silence her, to cast her as a problem. Instead, she had become the mirror that revealed them to the world. And now, with investors circling, employees whispering, and customers walking away, the airline teetered on the edge of collapse. The cabin lights of Flight 382 dimmed slightly as the plane leveled off above the clouds. Naomi Sinclair sat in her assigned seat. 2-0, looking out at the endless stretch of gray and white beneath. The hum of engines was steady, almost meditative, and for the first time since the airport, she allowed herself to breathe without a target. She had crossed the threshold of humiliation into a space where she could think, truly think, about the next moves. Around her, passengers settled into the flight with the casual indifference of those for whom air travel was routine. A child behind her kicked a bag. A man 2 rows forward read through an e-reader. A flight attendant passed quietly, offering water and a warm smile to those who asked. The normalcy contrasted sharply with the turmoil that had erupted just hours before. Naomi let herself observe the scene without judgment, noting the small human rhythms that persisted, despite chaos elsewhere. She placed her hands over her laptop bag, resting it against her knees, and allowed a long sigh to escape. The events of the morning replayed in her mind in sharp, jagged fragments. The gate agent's hand lifted as if to block her existence. The murmurs of passengers behind her. The officer hovering like a shadow over her every move. Each moment was a reminder that she had been seen not as a leader, not as a person, but as a problem to be contained. Naomi's mind wandered to the legal counsel back in New York. Jordan Miles had been a constant presence, her texts and calls a lifeline amid the storm. She could imagine Jordan pacing the conference room, phone pressed to her ear, trying to keep the narrative under control. Naomi smiled faintly at the thought. Jordan's energy was relentless, but Naomi's path was quieter, calculated, deliberate. She had learned long ago that rushing into reaction often undermined the strength of intention. Captain Meera Patel's voice broke her reverie as she stepped past the aisle, checking passengers and issuing a calm, professional greeting. Naomi offered a slight nod, which Meera returned with a quiet, knowing smile. In that brief exchange, Naomi felt a subtle affirmation. There were people who could see through pretense, who could recognize composure not as passivity, but as strategy. It was a small reassurance, but it carried weight in a world that had so often misread her presence. The clouds beneath shifted, gray giving way to patches of sunlight. Naomi's eyes followed the movement, letting the rhythm of the sky calm the tension coiled within her chest. She thought about the decision she had made at the gate, to stand silently while the world watched, to let injustice mark itself so clearly that it could no longer be ignored. It was not a decision made lightly. Her pulse had thrummed, adrenaline had surged, and yet she had remained seated, composed, eyes forward, refusing to grant legitimacy to the false narrative. Her thoughts drifted inward, toward the battles she had faced long before this moment. The boardrooms where she had been the only black executive. The meetings where her proposals had been dismissed until the profit line demanded attention. The countless occasions where her competence had been questioned before a word was spoken. Each memory was a stone in the foundation of her resilience. Each slight a test she had learned to convert into strength. The hum of the engines and the soft whir of the cabin air created a rhythm that almost resembled meditation. Naomi let herself sink into that rhythm, letting the tension in her shoulders release gradually. She focused on the smallest details, the way the folds of her blazer settled across her lap, the slight warmth of sunlight on her forearm, the muted rustle of other passengers adjusting their seats. The world outside was turbulent, chaotic, yet inside her own mind, she could carve a space of clarity. Questions arose in her mind, as they always did before she had to act. Would the airline acknowledge its mistake? Would the public see her silence as weakness or as quiet power? How far would the scrutiny extend? And how much damage might be done to the employees who had no role in the morning's incident? These questions did not unnerve her. They sharpened her focus, reminded her that every choice carried consequence, and that consequence was never neutral. She imagined the confrontation upon landing in New York, not loud, not angry, but precise, deliberate, carrying every ounce of dignity she had preserved. Every word, every gesture would be a declaration of agency. She thought of the cameras, the tweets, the endless speculation that would flood in the moment she appeared. Naomi allowed herself a quiet smile. Let the world watch. Let it witness the refusal to be diminished. She was not performing for them, but she understood the optics, and she knew that her composure was a weapon as powerful as any argument. Jordan's messages buzzed again, this time fewer in number, more patient. Naomi glanced at her phone briefly, acknowledging them with a calm tap, then returned it to her pocket. She did not need to explain herself. Not now, not ever. Her silence was not absence. It was strategy, a decision made in the knowledge that the world often rushed to interpret and misinterpret before understanding could be reached. For the first time in hours, Naomi allowed herself to feel something other than tension. There was clarity, a sense of preparedness, and a small, simmering satisfaction in the knowledge that she had chosen the path of integrity over panic. The flight continued its ascent, and as the sun broke through the clouds more fully, she could feel the weight of the morning slowly transforming into resolve. Every passenger on the plane carried their own stories, their own quiet struggles, none of which they had shared with her, none of which she needed to witness. And yet in that shared, fleeting moment at 35,000 feet, Naomi realized something profound. Dignity was not given. It was maintained. Composure was not passive. It was active. And strength was not measured in retaliation, but in the deliberate choice to act in alignment with one's values. Naomi leaned back in her seat. Closing her eyes for just a moment, she allowed herself a breath, deep and full, the kind that carried both reflection and preparation. Ahead lay confrontation. Yes, but it was not something she feared. It was something she was ready to meet on her own terms, with every ounce of her experience, intellect, and moral clarity intact. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of careful thought and strategic calm, there was a quiet fire, a fire fueled not by anger, but by the relentless certainty that truth, even when delayed, had the power to reshape the world. The hum of the engines was a constant companion, a metronome that measured time in a world that had become chaotic outside the cabin. Naomi Sinclair sat upright in her seat, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her laptop bag, a tactile reminder of stability in a moment of flux. She felt the subtle tension of every muscle in her body, not the tension of fear, but the tension of decision. She had choices to make, and each one carried consequences beyond her own experience. Her mind wandered back to the first moments at the gate, the flatness in the agent's voice, the certainty that she did not belong, the judgment that did not require proof. The memory pressed against her chest like an invisible weight, one that grew heavier with each passing second. She remembered how she had tried to maintain composure, how she had offered politeness instead of confrontation, only to be met with escalating dismissal. Naomi's thoughts shifted to the broader implications. She thought about the young black professionals who had quietly observed this moment, about the students who might watch a video and see someone like themselves being questioned, being treated as if they were less than. She imagined their faces, the mix of recognition and frustration, the silent tallying of injustices small and large. The burden of representation was not unfamiliar, but it was a weight she carried differently now, in this quiet compartment above the clouds. She recalled the calls from Jordan Miles, the flurry of messages from colleagues, the early news reports that had begun to frame the incident as a corporate misstep rather than an individual experience. Naomi felt a familiar surge of anger, not at the individuals, not at the agent or the bystanders, but at a system that normalized bias and demanded silence from those it marginalized. She let the anger pass through her without consuming her, like a river that could be acknowledged but not dammed. The flight attendant's voice broke her reverie. A calm announcement about beverage service passed, and Naomi took a sip of water, letting it ground her. Her gaze returned to the window, to the endless expanse of sky, and she realized the choice before her was not only about the immediate confrontation, but about the larger narrative she could shape. The silence she had maintained, the dignity she had preserved, could be leveraged not for revenge, but for truth, for accountability. As the plane cruised above the clouds, Naomi considered the legal and ethical paths open to her. She imagined the conversation she would have with the airline's executives upon landing. She thought about the evidence she had in hand, the video recordings, the corroborating witness statements, the digital timestamp of her ticket. She did not feel triumph in the anticipation of confrontation. She felt preparation, the quiet power of someone who knew her value and refused to allow it to be dismissed. The cabin around her moved in its ordinary rhythms, unaware of the storm that would erupt on the ground. A man 2 rows ahead fumbled with his headphones. A mother tried to calm a restless toddler. The stewardess quietly offered blankets to those who asked. Naomi observed all of it, noting human fragility alongside human resilience. She understood that the confrontation awaiting her was only one part of a larger story about human behavior, about entitlement, about the systems that govern interactions. Her thoughts turned inward again. She allowed herself to feel the lingering sting of humiliation, the shame she had refused to claim in public, but which resided stubbornly in her chest. She let the feelings wash over her, labeling them without judgment: hurt, frustration, indignation. Then she exhaled, releasing the emotions like letting go of weight she no longer needed to carry. The air inside her lungs seemed cleaner afterward, sharper, as if the acknowledgement had cleared a path for action. Naomi's mind began to formulate a strategy, not reactive, but proactive. She would not allow the morning's events to define her narrative. She would present herself with composure, with evidence, and with moral clarity. Her words would not be inflammatory, but precise, highlighting systemic issues without making the conversation personal. She would assert authority without aggression, influence without coercion, and she would demonstrate resilience in the face of bias. For the first time since the incident, Naomi felt a flicker of anticipation, not anxiety, the anticipation of a challenge met with integrity, the anticipation of a moment that could become more than personal vindication, a moment that could resonate widely, spark conversations, and, perhaps, inspire change. She considered the young professionals who might watch the coverage, the students who might see themselves reflected in her experience, and the broader society that might witness the subtle ways prejudice manifests in ordinary settings. As the plane approached cruising altitude, Naomi felt a calm determination settle over her. She straightened in her seat, adjusted her blazer, and reviewed the evidence stored securely on her tablet. Every photo, every video, every time-stamped detail was organized, ready to tell the story of what had happened and why it mattered. The moral weight of the situation did not frighten her. It focused her. She understood the stakes, and she was prepared to meet them with intelligence, grace, and clarity. The turbulence began briefly, the engines humming slightly louder. Naomi's eyes flicked to the window as clouds shifted and twisted, but she did not flinch. Her resolve mirrored the steadiness of the plane cutting through the sky. Outside, the world was unpredictable, but inside, within her own control, she maintained equilibrium. The morning had tried to strip her of dignity, but on this flight, she reclaimed it fully, silently. As preparation for the inevitable confrontation below, every detail mattered: the tone of her voice, the presentation of evidence, the calm clarity of her argument. Naomi understood that the incident was not merely about a boarding pass or a seat on a plane. It was about perception, power, and the invisible structures that determined who could move freely and who could be questioned without cause. Her approach would honor both the personal experience and the broader implications, showing that integrity could coexist with strategy, that strength could exist without aggression. By the time the pilot's voice announced the beginning of descent, Naomi had constructed the conversation in her mind. She had visualized the reactions, anticipated objections, and prepared responses that were firm but respectful. The moral clarity she felt in this moment was unshakable. The flight had given her more than altitude. It had given her perspective, a chance to distance herself from immediate emotion and approach the coming confrontation with unerring focus. The city's skyline emerged through scattered clouds, the streets glinting with the early sunlight. Naomi's fingers brushed the edge of her laptop bag, a grounding ritual that connected thought to action. Her chest was calm, her pulse steady. She had weathered the storm of public attention, the humiliation at the gate, and the internal conflict of indignation and patience. Now she was ready. As the landing gear deployed and the engines hummed with the resistance of descent, Naomi exhaled one final, deliberate breath. She would step onto the tarmac not as a victim, but as a witness to truth, a professional unshaken by injustice, a strategist in control of her narrative. The world below might be chaotic, biased, or impatient, but she was above it all, both literally and figuratively. prepared to land with dignity intact and purpose unwavering. The plane shuddered lightly as it descended into New York, the city skyline gradually emerging from the early morning mist. Naomi Sinclair sat rigidly in her seat, the familiar knot of anticipation tightening in her chest. Every eye in the cabin seemed preoccupied with the view, the seatbelt signs, the gentle hum of descending engines. Yet in her mind, the weight of what awaited her was inescapable. She had been quiet for hours, measured, letting the storm outside the cabin unfold without comment. Now, every thought, every movement was preparation. When the wheels touched down, the subtle jolt beneath her feet seemed almost ceremonial. The plane taxied toward the gate, engines lowering to an idle purr, and Naomi's pulse kept time with the final moments before the inevitable. Flight attendants moved with professional calm, guiding passengers with polite gestures and soft voices. Naomi gathered her belongings slowly, methodically, and when she stood, her posture was tall, unwavering, the kind of presence that demanded notice without demanding submission. As she approached the jet bridge, a figure from the airline's executive team waited. The hallway leading from the tarmac to the terminal had been cleared. Richard Calloway, the senior vice president, stepped forward, his expression taut with an uneasy mixture of authority and concern. He gestured toward a side office just beyond the main terminal doors. Naomi did not respond with words, only a subtle nod that acknowledged the path laid before her. The office was stark. Glass walls and a polished wooden table suggested openness, transparency. Yet the air felt thick with anticipation. Naomi took her seat at the head of the table, a position she claimed silently, commanding the room without raising her voice. Across from her, Calloway and two other executives shifted uncomfortably, their scripts of pre-planned apologies and excuses quickly unraveling in her presence. Naomi leaned forward, placing her boarding pass gently on the table. Her eyes met theirs steadily. "You have a choice here," she said quietly, her tone calm, yet carrying a weight that made silence in the room absolute. "You can continue to insist that what happened at the gate was acceptable, or you can acknowledge it, take responsibility, and take steps to ensure it never happens again." Calloway's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. The room's atmosphere was taut, fragile, like a suspended cord ready to snap. Naomi continued, her voice unwavering. "This isn't about a seat. This isn't about procedure. It is about the people you serve and the values you claim to uphold. It is about respect, equality, and accountability. If you cannot see that, then you are part of the problem." The executives exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Naomi let them feel the weight of the silence that followed. Every second stretched, the hum of the air conditioning punctuating the space between her words and their replies. This was not negotiation as they knew it. This was clarity, a mirror held up to their actions, exposing them. Richard finally spoke, his voice measured, almost careful. "Ms. Sinclair, we acknowledge the situation. We are prepared to take steps to address the gate incident. We will conduct an internal review, implement sensitivity training, and issue a public statement." Naomi's expression remained steady. "That is a start," she replied. "But words without action are meaningless. I want a clear plan, with deadlines and accountability, or this becomes more than a statement. It becomes a legal and social matter. Your company's reputation depends on more than just damage control. It depends on genuine change." There was a long pause. Naomi felt the room shift around her, the weight of expectation and responsibility pressing downward. She thought of the countless individuals who had already witnessed her treatment via social media. Their trust, their attention, their belief in justice rested on more than her courage. It rested on a system finally willing to respond appropriately. She finally stood, adjusting her blazer. The office seemed smaller now, the glass walls enclosing not just the executives, but the consequences of every decision they had made. Naomi's steps were deliberate, unhurried, each one reinforcing the strength that had carried her from Detroit to this moment in New York. At the doorway, she paused, looking back over her shoulder. The executives were seated, silent, their hands folded or clasped. Their previous confidence dissolved into something heavier, more reflective. Naomi allowed herself a small nod, an acknowledgement that she had given them a choice. Now, it was up to them to act. As she walked down the corridor toward the arrival hall, cameras flashed in the distance, journalists and onlookers capturing every movement. Naomi maintained her calm, measured gait, the epitome of control, her presence commanding without aggression. She could hear snippets of conversation, questions muttered in the air. Who is she? What is her story? Why did she remain so composed? And in that composure, Naomi Sinclair carried more than herself. She carried the dignity of countless others who had been questioned, dismissed, or silenced. She carried the weight of accountability, and in her silence, she delivered the loudest statement of all respect and equality are non-negotiable. By the time she reached the curb, a car awaited her, black and understated, unassuming in its design, yet ready to carry her into the next phase of the day. Naomi opened the door without rush, stepping inside with the same quiet power that had defined every moment since that fateful gate. The driver acknowledged her with a nod. No words were necessary. As the car merged into the flow of New York traffic, Naomi allowed herself a slow exhale. The confrontation was over, but the work had just begun. She knew the airline statement would be released. Social media would buzz anew, and reporters would follow every movement. Yet she also knew something vital had shifted. The moment had been captured. The truth had been delivered, and the principles she had fought to uphold would now demand action from others. In the rearview mirror, the city skyline flickered past, reflective glass and steel catching the early light. Naomi's mind wandered briefly to the people who had inspired her journey, her parents, her mentors, her employees, the young professionals watching from screens across the country. They would see that strength need not shout. It need only stand, unwavering, and demand what is right. She settled into the seat, her hands folded over her laptop bag, her gaze steady out the window. The hum of the engine now carried a sense of promise, a quiet rhythm that matched her pulse. Naomi Sinclair had walked through humiliation, confrontation, and media fire, and had emerged not diminished, but resolute. The city outside carried on, unaware of the full extent of the storm she had weathered. Yet she felt certain that her actions would resonate far beyond the confines of the airplane, the terminal, and the office. Naomi's eyes traced the horizon, the skyline stretching endlessly. She allowed herself a thought she had kept locked away for hours. The journey was far from over. There were battles ahead, changes to implement, and the kind of justice that required vigilance and persistence. Yet for now, in the quiet hum of the car, with the sunlight filtering through the buildings, Naomi Sinclair allowed herself a moment of clarity. She had made her choice. She had spoken truth, and the world, whether it was ready or not, had to listen. Her hand brushed lightly over her laptop bag once more, a tactile reminder of the responsibility she bore. In every glance, every subtle observation, every decision made in the coming days, Naomi would carry this moment forward. She had confronted power with composure, grace, and clarity, and in doing so, she had created a precedent that would not easily be forgotten. By the time the car turned onto the avenue leading to her office, Naomi's mind had already shifted to strategy, implementation, and the ripple effects of the morning's events. The confrontation had ended, but the work had begun. Her pulse had steadied, her focus sharpened, and her resolve strengthened. Naomi Sinclair had walked through fire, and now, more than ever, she knew exactly where she needed to go. The terminal felt different when Naomi Sinclair stepped off the plane. The hum of the airport seemed quieter, the fluorescent lights softer, the air somehow lighter. She walked with the steady rhythm of someone who had navigated a storm without losing sight of her own compass. Behind her, the events of the past hours lingered, a tapestry of conflict, judgment, and resilience stitched together by small but powerful acts of dignity. She had expected tension at the arrival gate, perhaps even hostility, but what greeted her instead was a mixture of surprise, uncertainty, and cautious respect. Airline officials, those who had moments ago dismissed her presence, now hovered in small clusters, their expressions unreadable. Naomi knew she did not owe them gratitude, nor did she expect contrition, but she recognized the significance of her own silence and the quiet power it carried. In a small office near the jet bridge, executives from Helios Nexus and the airline convened for the first time since the viral incident had erupted. Naomi entered deliberately, her posture calm, her presence commanding without needing to assert dominance. Richard Calloway, Stephen Ward, and other senior leaders shifted in their seats, aware that the narrative they had tried to control was no longer theirs to shape. Naomi's gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on each face, not in accusation, but in measured observation. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, layered with the weight of clarity and authority. She outlined the failures she had witnessed, the missteps of personnel, and the cascading consequences of those choices. Her language was precise, her tone composed, and yet beneath it all, a current of moral force ran through every sentence. The executives listened, some with furrowed brows, others with quiet acknowledgement. Naomi did not shout. She did not demand. She did not dramatize. She simply stated facts, outlined consequences, and highlighted what needed to change. In that moment, she became more than a passenger wronged. She became a mirror reflecting accountability, integrity, and the standards to which everyone should be held. Meanwhile, the video that had ignited public outrage continued to circulate across news feeds and social media platforms. Comment sections brimmed with conversation, debate, and reflection. Some expressed anger at the airline, some praised Naomi's composure, and others wrestled with their own assumptions about authority, identity, and respect. The incident sparked conversations that extended far beyond the confines of the airport, touching on societal structures, unconscious bias, and the responsibilities of institutions to uphold dignity. Back at her hotel later that evening, Naomi reflected quietly. Alone in a room softened by golden lamplight, she traced the events of the day with her mind, moving from the tension of the gate to the viral video, to the media storm, and finally to the conference room where she had faced those in power. Each memory carried weight, but also a sense of triumph, not in vengeance, but in truth. Her composure had not only preserved her dignity, it had forced those around her to confront theirs. In that quiet moment, Naomi allowed herself a small, private smile. The fight had not been about humiliation. It had been about justice, about accountability, and about modeling a standard of strength that did not need to shout to be heard. She had turned what could have been a moment of despair into a turning point, one that rippled far beyond herself. The story would live on, carried by news reports, social media, and word of mouth. But Naomi did not linger on the amplification. She focused instead on what she could influence directly, on the steps forward in her work, her company, and her life. She thought of the passengers she had observed during the flight attendants who had acted professionally despite flawed directives, and the small human acts that persisted even amidst chaos. Those threads reminded her that integrity was not an abstract concept. It was enacted in real time, in every choice, no matter how small. As she packed her belongings, preparing to leave the hotel and step back into a world now more attentive to the incident, Naomi felt the quiet satisfaction of moral certainty. She had acted not out of anger or self-interest, but out of conviction, empathy, and clarity. The echoes of the day's events would linger, but she had anchored herself firmly in the knowledge that she had done what was right. Naomi's phone buzzed lightly on the bedside table. A message from Jordan Miles, brief and understated. You handled everything with strength and grace. The board is moving forward on your recommendations. Naomi read the words, and her fingers lingered on the screen. She did not respond immediately. She let the moment settle, letting the calm after the storm wash over her, unspoken but deeply understood. In the silence that followed, she realized that the day's events, though draining and tumultuous, had reaffirmed the principles she had lived by for decades: patience, resilience, empathy, and courage. And in that quiet affirmation, she found a sense of peace, rare for someone navigating the chaotic intersections of power, identity, and public scrutiny. Naomi stood by the window, looking out at the city lights reflected in the glass. Somewhere in the urban sprawl, lives had been touched, perceptions had shifted, and conversations had begun that might not have otherwise occurred. The ripple of one person's calm but unwavering insistence on dignity had extended farther than anyone in the room could have predicted, and as she left the room, suitcase in hand, Naomi Sinclair carried not only her belongings, but the quiet knowledge that she had faced injustice, navigated it with strength, and created a space where accountability and truth could take root. The airport, the plane, the viral video, the boardroom all had been stages on which she enacted a profound truth composure. Integrity and empathy could be more powerful than any shout, any protest, or any demand. She walked into the evening, ready to return to work, ready to continue building her company, and ready to live by the principles that had guided her through every challenge. Naomi Sinclair had not merely survived the storm. She had transformed it into a lesson, a catalyst, and a beacon for what could be achieved when strength met conscience. Naomi Sinclair's story is more than an incident at an airport gate. It's a mirror reflecting the prejudices that quietly shape our world, and the courage it takes to stand against them. Her quiet strength, measured response, and unwavering dignity remind us that true power isn't always loud, but it is deeply felt. As the media storm settles and the airline scrambles to respond, we are left to question our own assumptions, our own biases, and the moments when we choose to act or remain silent. Naomi's journey teaches us that standing tall in the face of injustice can inspire change far beyond a single boarding gate. Her story leaves us both inspired and unsettled, making us examine the way we treat those who society tells us don't belong. It is a call to empathy, to respect, and to vigilance against discrimination in all its subtle forms. If Naomi's courage moved you, like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned for more stories that challenge, inspire, and reveal the humanity within each of us. Don't miss the next chapter of stories that make you think, feel, and stand up.